Welcome to the Cinematic Flashback Podcast. Get ready to hop into the Wayback Machine as we journey through the wild, bold, and unforgettable films of the 1970s. Each episode, we'll break down a classic movie or forgotten gem by exploring the who's who of each film, dive into the premise and the plot, see how it performed then and now, and wrap things up with, did it groove through the decades or did it lose its beat? Joining me is, of course, my co-host Matt Sargent. Welcome.
Hello, Chuck. Thanks for having me.
Hey, man. How you been?
Pretty good. I think if you listen to our last podcast, I have recovered from that terrible cold.
Oh, yeah. You sound much better today.
I do. I feel a lot better.
We don't have quite the smooth, deep tones.
Well, I can do it if we need to.
Today we'll be talking about Kelly's Heroes from 1970, which is a film about a motley crew of American GIs during World War II who go AWOL to rob a French bank that's located 30 miles behind German lines of its stored Nazi gold bars worth $16 million. Let's play the trailer before we give our opening thoughts.
Kelly! What the hell are you doing here?
Looking after the colonel, that's what.
Shoot him and let's get the hell out of here.
Shoot him, we don't get the gold.
What gold?
If you whisper one word about the gold to these guys, I'm gonna have you bounce from this outfit so fast your feet won't even touch the ground.
Okay, Kelly. What is it?
I want the intelligence reports for this whole sector, and I need them in the next 2 hours.
That's nice. What's in it for me?
It's behind enemy lines.
I got 3 Shermans outside.
His name's Oddball.
A Sherman can give you a very nice edge.
It's still up.
No, it ain't.
Loud ball better show up, Kelly.
Come on, let's move it up.
But my hair is still in curls. Oh, sure, I'll get a rupture yet with this thing.
Hey, nobody said anything about schlepping his 30 caliber machine gun all over the country.
I'll make it $50 if you carry the machine gun, huh?
And who's that bunch of refugees over there?
The band.
The band? What do we need a band for?
You see, we're just a private enterprise operation.
Those freaks. That ain't an army, it's a circus.
It could be the perfect crime.
Matt, what are your opening thoughts on this movie?
So it's a Clint Eastwood movie, so obviously I come into it with positive thoughts and positive memories. I do remember seeing this movie early in my life, not when it was in the movie theaters, I think. In 1970, I was 9 years old.
8.
So.
Oh. I'm starting to know your age.
Yes. Yeah, I'm old, but not that old. If you talk to my brother, my older brother, he probably saw it in the movie theater, so I would have to talk to him about it. But yeah, I love Clint Eastwood. I mean, I'm a huge fan, and I'm a huge fan. This is an interesting movie. We have lots of little tidbits to cover, so it'll be fun to talk about.
This was a first watch for me, and to be honest, I assumed it was going to be more in the line of The Dirty Dozen or Force 10 from Navarone, so I kind of knew the basic premise of the whole heist portion of the movie. So in my mind, I'm thinking it's going to be a military version of The Italian Job. But what I didn't realize is that it was a war movie and it was a heist movie, but it was also a comedy, and I was not expecting that. If we don't have any more opening thoughts, let's go ahead and get into the production of the film.
Goggles on, please.
Lights, camera, action!
To remove your goggles.
Kelly's Heroes was an MGM picture that was released on June 23, 1970, with a runtime of 2 hours and 24 minutes. It was directed by Brian G. Hutton from a story by Troy Kennedy Martin, who had previously written The Italian Job. Lalo Schifrin composed the music and featured his song Burning Bridges, performed by the Mike Curb Congregation. The movie has a budget of $4 million and grossed $5.2 worldwide. It was produced by the Warriors Company and filmed on location in Yugoslavia, Croatia, and Serbia. Kelly's Hero has a platoon-sized cast led by Clint Eastwood as the titular character, Telly Savalas as the platoon sergeant, Don Rickles as a supply sergeant, and Donald Sutherland as a different kind of tank commander. Matt, did you have any notes on production for Kelly's Heroes?
One of the one of the things I found interesting is why did they film it in Yugoslavia, Croatia, and Serbia? And it turns out for some pretty good reasons. Evidently, those countries still had quite a few Sherman tanks laying around. They also had some old tanks that they could dress up to look like King Tiger tanks, which are part of the story. And also they had some damage from the war in a lot of small abandoned towns. And they were able to leverage and use one of those as the site for the big battle at the end. That's pretty interesting why they did that.
Also, during the production of this film, one of the actors nearly lost his life.
I think you're referring to Donald Sutherland, who came down with meningitis during the filming and really was in a very bad shape. In fact, I think they called his wife to come and help nurse him and possibly...
I believe that when they called her, they said, be prepared that he may pass away prior to. But he didn't, luckily.
Thank goodness, because Kiefer Sutherland, which I'm assuming was born after this, although he might have been born near the same time, is also a wonderful actor, in my opinion. Some people don't like Kiefer. I really like him.
You had mentioned that the crazy thing about this movie is that it's based on a true incident.
Yeah, I only know that the original material was written because some rogue units of the American and German army units went and basically secured a bunch of gold.
Incidentally, the Guinness Book of World Records, starting in the 1960s, listed this as the biggest robbery ever. How's that?
That's amazing. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, I'm not sure when it got surpassed, which is interesting because maybe that's a good movie too.
Yeah.
I want to mention that this platoon-sized cast has some very notable actors playing minor roles. We have Harry Dean Stanton, who went on to Alien, playing the smart aleck Private Willard. Carroll O'Connor. We talked about Carroll O'Connor in The French Connection with Archie Bunker. He played General Colt.
He was hilarious in this movie. In my opinion, he carries the show.
His scenes are very entertaining, and I look forward to talking about that.
Yes.
Gavin MacLeod, who played Captain Steubing on the Love Boat, was the tank mechanic Moriarty. Lynn Lesser, who plays Uncle Leo from Seinfeld, was the engineering sergeant. And a cameo that was made in this film was by the second unit assistant director, who was John Landis. He had an uncredited cameo as one of the four nuns seen near the end of the film. And interestingly, he shares that while he was in Yugoslavia, he came up with the story for an American Werewolf in London after seeing locals performing rituals on a man buried so that he would not rise up from the grave.
I think you're actually referring to the Romani people, who are what we would call, colloquially, the gypsies.
That's an interesting connection because we have one of our characters is very gypsy-esque.
Yes, exactly.
So what about Sergeant Joe? He used the Michelin book.
Yeah, I thought that was a funny thing that I'll bet you somebody who actually served in World War II pointed out to them, or the writer knew that, because that was actually accurate. They used the Michelin Tourist Guidebook. It had great maps. It knew where all the major towns were and if they had a hotel, and not that they were going to be staying in the hotels, but it definitely gave them a leg up on. Incidentally, a good deal of effort was spent by the underground in the occupied territories supplying maps to the Allied forces when they were on the move in those countries.
One of the big fears that the Allied command had was that the Germans would reverse signs and mess with them. So they wanted to make sure that they not only had the battlefield maps, but they also had details on locations to look for.
Yeah, I think is it Catch-22, or there's another movie where the Germans actually mess with the signs at one point. Maybe it was The Dirty Dozen. I'm not sure. It was something like that, but it was a thing that did get done because of, obviously, if you're not familiar with the area and you look at the signs.
Donald Sutherland, going back to him, had told John Landis that if he was ever a director, he would appear in all of his movies. Well, that didn't happen, but he appeared in a lot of them, including the Kentucky Fried Movie, National Lampoon's Animal House, and he was on the billboard in the Blues Brothers. So he may have had small parts, but he would appear in them.
I remember him in National Lampoon's Animal House. He was a professor who was having a liaison with a college student, the girlfriend of one of the characters.
Yeah.
And he was, small part, but very impactful and hilarious, actually, if you remember it.
In the Kentucky Fried Movie, he is just basically walking by. He just has like a quick walk by, and you go, wait, was that Donald Sutherland?
I love Donald Sutherland. I think
Yeah.
he's a treasure, and we've seen him in a couple of movies here where he's just this is the range of the guy. Because in this movie, the person he plays in the movie, Don't Look Now, he's a completely different character. This is an amazing actor.
Clint Eastwood had signed on to do this picture because his director friend Don Siegel was originally set to direct the picture. And Brian G. Hutton signed on after Siegel had to drop to finish post-production of another Eastwood collaboration called Two Mules for Sister Sarah. Eastwood and Hutton had previously worked together on Where Eagles Dare, which Hutton is most known for. Hutton took a 7-year Hollywood hiatus between 1973 and 1980 before returning for a few more years, only to leave Hollywood for good after he had directed 1983's High Road to China with Tom Selleck. Did you see that movie?
I remember seeing it. I remember it being kind of not great, but I could be wrong on that.
It was in that era where everyone was trying to cash in on Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, it was like an also ran, I think. It's what that's.
Yeah.
And I love Tom Selleck. He's one of my favorite guys as well. He was.
He was a hot property at that time.
Yeah.
Let's see. In Kelly's Heroes, I counted one Wilhelm scream. So have you ever heard of the Wilhelm scream?
No, I have.
Okay, I'm gonna play it for you right now, and from now on,
now I'll notice it.
When you hear it, you'll say, "That's a Wilhelm." My wife even counts Wilhelms now.
Isn't that funny?
So.
That's like me now after I got a drone. Years ago when I got my drone. Now when I look at movies, I can't help but say, "That's a drone shot. That's a drone shot. That's a drone shot." Okay, so where are we at?
The sound of the Tiger Tank turret was reused in 1986's Aliens as the sound of the power loaders that Ripley used to defeat the Queen at the end of the movie.
Where you want it.
Oh, that's amazing. That's great, because that was a great sound effect. They were really well done with because it was the thing she stood in, right, and drove.
Yep.
That's a cool callback to a sound.
What I would really like to know is if that was the real sound of the turret, if that was filmed on location, or if that was something that they added afterwards. Because there's a scene we'll talk about where they added some other embellishments. So this could have been a post-production.
I will say that we know that those weren't really Tiger tanks.
Oh, really?
Yeah, those were not real Tiger tanks. They were some other kind of tank that was dressed up to look like a tiger. And I actually have some trivia about Tiger tanks from a good friend of our family who was a tank commander in World War II.
Oh, hit me with it.
He was tank commander. He actually fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and he told me the story that they had captured about a dozen Tiger tanks, and they were driving them back to the rear to examine them, to go back to the rear and take them apart and figure out where their weaknesses are and what could be done. And it was about a 30 or 40 mile trip. And he said by the end of the 30 or 40 miles, one of them made it. They were so heavy and they vibrated so much, and their engines were so big that they just shook themselves to death. So the normal mode for the Germans were to roll those around on freight cars, on cars on the rail, and they would drive them to the battlefield. Then they'd roll them off. They'd only use them on the battlefield in open territory, and then roll them back onto trains, because if they drove them any amount of distance, they fell apart. And he said the reason they arrived with one is they kept taking the parts off others as they broke down to fix them until they only had one left.
Wow.
So there is almost none. I have seen it's called a King Tiger tank, and I have seen it in the Bovington Tank Museum in England when I was there in 1980 when I was visiting. And it's an amazing machine. It's absolutely gigantic with armor so thick you can't imagine it. And that's absolutely true when they show our shots. I don't know if you've seen in, what's the movie, Fury. They have some really good scenes about tank battles, and they just show the American shells just bouncing off the armor. And that was absolutely true. You had to get behind them, and you had to shoot them. What Donald Sutherland says in the movie, you got to get right behind them, and you have to shoot them point blank, was the only way to kill them.
Tiger is an open country tank. We happen to have these in a small town with narrow streets. And we do have the element of surprise.
Yeah. Look, Kelly, a tiger has only one weak point. You gotta hit it point blank, and you gotta hit it from behind.
Wow, that's cool. So there's some accuracy.
There's even more, and I don't know if it's a good place to do it, but there's even more. Donald Sutherland, in part of the movie, talks about how fast his tanks are, that his mechanic has improved their speed going forward and backward.
This engine's been modified by our mechanical genius here, Moriarty. These tanks are faster than any other tanks in the European theater of operations, forwards or backwards. See, man, we like to feel that we can get out of trouble quicker than we got into it.
This is absolutely the technique that you had to use with fighting a Tiger tank. You had to get close, and you had to move fast, and our Shermans could move fast because their tank their turret on a King Tiger was so heavy that it could only slew at a certain rate. So if you were more than a few hundred yards away, the tank turret could turn and aim at you and put a giant shell in you. But if you closed it within 100 yards, it couldn't slew its cannon around fast enough to get at you. And that's what they did in the Battle of the Bulge. They ran those Shermans as fast as they could, moving them all the time and getting behind them. So
that's interesting.
That's absolutely accurate that they were souping up the engines because they wanted to go fast.
That's very interesting. Did he ever say anything about extending the barrel of
Nah,
the
they didn't do that. But he did talk about Kentucky windage, which is the first time I ever heard that term. Which is, like if you shoot a bullet and it hits to the left, so you start aiming to the right. And I made the goofy teenage comment of, well, why didn't you just fix the sights?
And
his response was, I was getting shot at by another tank.
They're filling me full of holes.
So we just went with what we worked. He was a funny guy. He was an actual tank commander in World War II. He had, and I always regret not really asking him tons more questions about the war. I mean, he told us quite a bit, and he told us a lot of stories about the Battle of the Bulge, and he left a lot unsaid, obviously.
Right.
But it was an amazing ability. I mean, I always feel myself blessed that I was able to talk to somebody who was actually there.
Before we move on to our next segment, where we're going to talk about what we liked in the film, I had one last piece of trivia. So in 1970, there were 3 films that took place in another war, like World War II or Korea, but they were making social commentaries on the current war in Vietnam. Those films were Kelly's Heroes, of course, MASH, also starring Donald Sutherland, and a film you mentioned just a few minutes ago, Catch-22. And I haven't seen Catch-22 yet.
Oh, that's a great one. I barely remember it, so that would be a good one. If we review that one, it'll be fun to rewatch it.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory.
Let's dive into what we liked about this film. What worked for you?
I have to think a little bit, because I'll be honest with you, this wasn't one that sort of was knocking out of the park for me the whole time. But I think the humor of Carroll O'Connor is what made this movie for me. He is hilarious in this movie, and I don't think very many actors could have pulled off the absurdity and humor that he was able to do so well.
All of his scenes were over the top in everything, and just sort of highlighted what they were going for, which was that the upper command didn't know anything about what was going on.
Yeah, I think I kind of referred to them as the Keystone Cops. But one of the other things is things were on point in this movie for a couple of reasons. One of them was costuming. And I don't know if you remember, but he comes down in a red robe that has his stars on it.
His rings.
It's hilarious. And then, of course, there's just a bunch of funny scenes. I mean, every scene he's in is pretty funny. Even before the action happens and he's complaining about not getting any progress and how things aren't, no one has this fighting spirit. That comes back through a couple of times.
Yeah.
So he's funny in that. And then when things start to happen, he's even funnier because they're trying to obviously serve him this fancy breakfast at the same time. He's on the radio and he has a classic, in my opinion, one of the funniest parts of the whole movie is he's like, leave me alone, the game's on.
Hey,
What do you want me to do with this?
Get the hell out of here, bouncer. We got the game on.
That was great. Yes. My favorite line of his is where he looks at one of his lieutenants and they've just let them know that they've lost all of their aerial photographs. And Carol O'Connor just kind of looks at the camera and says,
"Did you lose my aerial photographs?"
They did a great job with that because they immediately, the next scene, which is perfect, is Donald Sutherland and his group, basically with all the maps spread out in front of them.
all laid out in front of him. The thing I liked most about this movie was the incredible cast that they had. They did a great job casting this film.
I would 100% agree. They did a great job casting it. And we know that because those actors all went on to pretty remarkable careers in Hollywood. Obviously, Clint Eastwood and Donald Sutherland. I mean, you can't even...
Telly Savalas
as
Sergeant Joe.
And even the minor characters, you saw them come up and up and up again. And, Seinfeld and the Love Boat. I mean, not saying that's high art, but I mean, we're talking about, working actors.
But again, working actors. And these are things we were watching in the 70s. I mean, I remember watching The Love Boat. We talked about the humor of Carol O'Connor. And also Don Rickles had a lot of great comedic moments. But also what I liked were the more subtle moments that I found very funny. For example, this movie starts off with a cold open. Clint Eastwood is in an American Jeep with the star on the top as a Jeep we've seen in every World War II film. In the back seat is another one of his platoon members and this German lieutenant whom they have kidnapped, who has the bars of gold that leads them on this mission. And they are stopped in a line, like a traffic stop, and there's just Germans all around them. And one German soldier is going through, and he's like looking around and everything. And he looks right at him, and it doesn't dawn on him that that's an American Jeep. I kind of found that funny.
Yes, it was funny. It does ultimately dawn on him because, they take off. But what was funny in that cold opening, and I did notice this when I was watching the movie again, because I recall this particular thing, is you're very confused there because you're like, that's definitely an American Jeep, but every other helmet is a German helmet. And and the guy directing traffic is yelling German phrases and everything's German. And I was like, is this after the war? And, we're occupying Germany. What's happening? And then all heck breaks loose when they are discovered and they take off in the Jeep. And I don't know if that's not that plausible. My guess is if you pop behind German lines and you happen to be in a Jeep and you go through a town and it's a giant traffic jam, just kind of sit there and play it cool, I guess. It's dark. There's no street lights. Remember that. I mean...
Oh, yeah.
I will say that when in the filming, they do like they do for all films. I don't know if you know this, and we've seen it, when we watch science fiction, they always have some way of lighting the people's faces.
Yeah.
So you can see
indirect lighting is coming from somewhere.
Right. In real life, they would never have had all that light streaming in on the people inside the car. But if without it, it would just be, you wouldn't be able to see anything in the car. So obviously it was a necessity for sort of showing that someone's there. But it's always hilarious because it's like, I can't imagine anybody driving those Jeeps with those lights from the dashboard blaring into their face.
One other thing that I really liked about this film was sometimes when you watch World War II films, especially, or actually any war film, especially in the more modern era, the violence is in check with what the subject matter is. And sometimes it makes it hard to show it or watch it with other people. What I liked about this film is that while there were explosions going on, bodies weren't being torn apart. So, I mean, I probably could watch this film with my grandmother and not feel like I have to fast forward or pause something.
Yeah, I think a good contrast is to contrast that with Saving Private Ryan.
Right.
You can't watch that with someone who isn't got... I mean, because there are scenes in that where it's just heart-wrenching, and very up close, really bad stuff. Great movie, don't get me wrong. It's a great movie, but you would have to be careful of who you watched it with.
Yeah, Saving Private Ryan is a hyper-realistic version. This is still a heist movie and a comedy. And so I was happy that they didn't try to make it something else in terms of the tone of that making it a full-on war movie.
Yeah,
although it was still a good World War II movie.
Yeah, and I think probably one of the places where it was very stark was when they were, towards the end, when they were assaulting the town. At one point you see a guy, and a German is patrolling, and one of our guys comes out and kind of follows them, and then you don't see anything, and then they're back behind a vehicle, and all you see is legs, and the next thing you do is you see the American kind of laying this guy down, right? So you know that there was some, knife work going on, horrifying, but it wasn't in your face, and but it was still like it's war. People are going to get hurt.
It's a war film that the casual viewer can go and watch and enjoy it for not only its comedic elements, its adventure, because it is an adventure, it is a heist film, but they also might enjoy something that I was not expecting. And I did put this into something that I liked, which was somewhere in the middle of watching this film, it started to dawn on me that this was a movie that took place in World War II, but they were making comments about Vietnam.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think you had mentioned that to me before I rewatched the film. And to be honest with you, that once you sort of think about that, and while you're watching the movie, it makes a lot more sense. If you have any knowledge of some of the things that went on in Vietnam, the idea of barbecues and trying to bring America, and a lot of that went on in Vietnam, you see echoes of that kind of counterculture. Why are we fighting this war? We even comes out in the dialogue. What are we fighting this war for? We don't even know.
And that serves as motivation for Kelly as to why he wants to go 30 miles behind enemy lines to rob this bank, because here we're getting shelled by our own troops, and for what, $5 a week or whatever it was some pittance that they were being paid.
I think the other thing to bring out on that is that, as we know, the character Kelly, when we meet him in the movie, he's been busted down to a low rank. He was actually an officer before, and at first you just know that he was busted down. You don't know really why, but later it's revealed to you that he was busted down because an operation went bad and they had to pin it on someone, and they pinned it on him. And I think that plays into his attitude of, well, if that's what they're going to do to me, then I'm going to just steal this gold.
I also like Telly Savalas' Big Joe character, because he's the platoon sergeant. He's the one who feels responsible for the men. And, he's kind of betrayed by the captain, who is wanting to steal a sailboat, and he takes off and doesn't come back to the end after all of the action happens. So he feels like they've abandoned him, and so it's his responsibility to take care of his men. And I like that not everybody's character was motivated by money or by the gain of these gold bars. His motivation was he wanted to keep his troops safe, and they needed someone who would lead them. Otherwise, I don't think he had that same confidence in Kelly at the beginning.
I think also there was a betrayal from his commanding officer, because he had been pursuing his commanding officer for some R&R time, because his guys had been in the thick of it. And his R&R that the commanding officer arranged was an abandoned house. And there was a big argument, or a big
abandoned town.
Abandoned town, but essentially a house. And it was part of the setup, obviously, but it was also part of the mistreatment and response. So
this mistreatment, the response, the disillusionment, all of that is what a 1970s movie viewer would not associate with the heroics as they were portrayed of World War II. I think it was not until Saving Private Ryan and other later World War II movies that we realized that not everything was gung-ho.
Obviously, there was quite a number of works that came out. We had a propaganda machine like everybody did at the time during the war, trying to make sure that the American people and the industrial strength of our country was backing those soldiers, and that's sort of what happened. And I think there's a lot of overlap of that and hero worship and that sort of thing. And then as we started to get a real picture of what actually was happening, and certainly in Vietnam, it sort of removed the veil a little bit. So that definitely, I think there was definitely social commentary about Vietnam that you would not normally see in a World War II movie. It comes through, for sure.
I just wanted to comment on how impressed I am with Donald Sutherland. After watching him in this movie and then comparing him to what he did in Don't Look Now, this guy had some acting chops. He is really, really good. And I did not realize when we started this how much I was just going to be blown away by Donald Sutherland.
I have loved Donald Sutherland's acting for many, many years. Like I said before, of his son Kiefer, I think he is actually a very underrated actor. Some people find him not great, but I've always liked all the roles he's been in, from The Lost Boys to 24, and I think he's really good too. I think it's definitely a family business for them.
The last comment that I want to make is about Clint Eastwood. Something that kind of hit me last night when I was watching this. I told my wife, Clint reminds me of that generation's Harrison Ford, just able to play all sorts of roles. He was excellent in this one.
He was excellent in this film, and I think one of the things that we talked about was Clint's disillusionment with this particular movie. It was not the movie he really had thought it could be or should be, and I think that kind of comes through a little bit in the movie, I would say. But I will say the interesting thing, and I think you pointed it out to me, Chuck, is that he took that disillusionment, instead of just being frustrated and annoyed, he's like, well, I can do something about this. I'll be the producer on my next films. And then he moves from production into, because production can impact the film to some extent, but not like a director can. And he becomes a director. He becomes an actor's director. Actors love to act for Clint Eastwood.
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here?
Okay, let's talk about some of the things that didn't work so well for us.
I think the pacing was poor at the beginning. There's just a lot not happening right after we're introduced to Kelly. I mean, yeah, there's the barrage and there's the bug out from the bat, that they're fighting and stuff like that. But then after that, there's a whole lot of talking where they're trying to convince people to support this endeavor. And that went on too long, in my opinion. And then the other thing that went on too long is there was when they decided to do it and they start trying to get through the German lines, there's two battles going on. One with Kelly and his people, and they're out front. And then Oddball, the Donald Sutherland character, and his tanks are kind of following because they were delayed a day. And so you have another whole battle to get through the line, which seemed to me kind of silly. Why wouldn't they have waited for
an additional day?
Yes, waited until the tanks and then all been together. Because, I mean, honestly, tanks and infantry, they go together like peanut butter and jelly, right?
Yeah.
So some of that was what, and obviously, I guess it was part of the story and whatnot, but to me, it was sort of silly.
Speaking about the pacing, it's almost a 2.5 hour film. And at the very end with the Battle of Claremont, when they're trying to set all the pieces in place so then they can begin executing their plan to finally get to the goal, that took 15 minutes of setup. And at some point, I was like, just get on with it.
Yeah, at one point, I think they said they ran the Tiger tanks a couple of times a day for 20 minutes. That 20 minutes felt like an hour.
I actually felt like that we experienced the 20 minutes altogether, because once they got into it, right?
Yeah.
It picked back up again.
Yeah, I think that was one of the other things I had a problem with is, okay, so you're in a town, you've got 3 Tiger tanks, which are open field tanks, so it's ludicrous that you would be defending
Why are
it.
They even there?
Yeah, it's ridiculous why you'd even defend it with Tiger tanks.
They had smaller tanks, right?
Well, you don't even need a tank. You need a couple of gun emplacements. And
there you go.
And guys in the belfry, which was ridiculous that the Germans didn't have anybody in the bell tower.
Yeah.
But we had 2 guys in the bell tower watching everybody and then later shooting people. So some of that was like, I'm not so sure about all of that. That was a little bit a bridge too far.
No pun intended there. That was good.
To sum up my issues with the film are the setup of the battle and that sort of thing seemed silly to me. They could have just had a contingent of people defending and had a real battle with machine guns and move and shoot and all that stuff. And then it's down to just a few people, and now we need help opening the bank, right?
Right.
You could have left the tanks completely out of it.
They ultimately didn't have as big of an impact as they kept making it out to be.
They only had one tank when they got
up
to the town and almost immediately broke down.
Right.
And they killed one Tiger tank with the tank. The other one got destroyed. I don't know how. It just blew up at one point.
I thought there were some missed opportunities that they had set up earlier. I was hoping that at this moment, but they did talk about firing the rounds that they had removed the explosives from it and replaced with paint. So when they shot the back of the Tiger and it was red paint, Private Kelly had the best expression on his face, like, what the heck is that?
That is a funny one. And that was a setup because it was really, it was like a third of the way to the movie when Donald Sutherland and his group says, we like to put paint in some of the shells because it really it really freaks out the enemy. They had big loudspeakers on their tanks and would play music as they went into battle.
Yeah.
And
when the tanks were reconnecting with the platoon, they're playing the Battle Hymn of the Republic
right,
out of the loudspeakers.
And the other thing, they did a lot of funny things with the sound. And another joke was early when the tanks do their first battle, they come through the rail tunnel and they're in a rail yard that's occupied by Germans, and they start shooting it up, and they're playing I've been working on the rail. That was hilarious. I thought it was really funny. I think you're spot on. It's a little bit too long. They could have cut out a lot more. It was a different time for movies. People went to the movie and they expected to be in there for a couple hours and a half. Nowadays, you're shocked if a movie goes 2 hours.
One of the things I have noticed is trailers from this era are absent of the movie voice, and they are approximately 3 minutes in length, and they show quite a bit of the film. When we listen to the trailer for this film, I edited it down because I don't want our listeners listening to 3 minutes of what we're going to talk about.
Right.
But just to get a little bit of the flavor. So a little bit different time in terms of the pacing.
Yeah.
I found the anachronisms just a bit jarring. I liked it, but I didn't like it, especially kind of the character of Oddball, who has kind of that hippie/gypsy spirit about him and their entire tank crew.
We definitely see that as a real echo of the times, right? This movie was filmed obviously in 1969 or early 1970, so we're talking the whole counterculture thing, and they definitely would fit well into those characters. But I think you're right. I think that's a pretty long road to hoe there.
I thought Brian G. Hutton did a great job, right? I have no complaints about his directing in this film. However, I would have loved to have seen Don Siegel direct this movie. I think that we would have gotten something that was closer to Dirty Harry as far as the action. I think the action would have been taken up just a notch with Don Siegel.
I would agree that's probably true, but I think one of the more redeeming parts of this film, in my opinion, is its humor. And it's hard to increase the humor when you level up the seriousness of, for instance, if the battle scenes were much more serious and much more realistic. It would have been hard to switch to the lighthearted, over-the-top of Carol O'Connor, if that was the case. So it's one of those things where it's sort of like, it's a balance sometimes. And sometimes if you turn something up, something else has got to go down. They don't both go up.
Right. Are we ready to move on to our favorite scenes?
Sure.
Easy, miss. I've got you.
You've got me. Who's got you?
Okay, let's go ahead and dive into scenes that we really, really liked and want to tease out a bit more.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few that are funny, that at least were funny to me. So obviously, as I said before, I think most of the scenes with Carol O'Connor playing it over the top for this general was nice for me. I liked them. They were funny. And I especially liked that his staff is trying to give him his breakfast and they're crowding around him while he's listening to the battle on the radio. And he yells at them to get out of the way. We got the game on. It was just really funny.
Hey, what? Where are you from, Sergeant?
Jersey City.
Stand up straight when the general speaks to you.
Well, now, don't you feel bad about it. You're a hell of a soldier, and I just want to shake your hand. All America's real proud of you today. All right, come on. I got a medal here in the Jeep for you.
Men, 16 million bucks shot.
And then I think one of the other ones was, I guess, the character Crap Game. They also called him Crap all the time. Yeah. But the funny part about it is, during the battle, an outhouse gets blown up around him, and he's covered in crap. So that was kind of a funny sort of callback to him being called Crap all the time.
God almighty. You guys smell like you fell into a dung heap.
Kind of makes you homesick, don't it?
You know, it does kind of, don't it, old buddy?
Yeah.
Kind of makes you homesick, don't it?
That was a hilarious scene. That was really funny. He's so quick with the comebacks. That was classic Don Rickles shtick with the quick comeback and the zinger. There's no way somebody wrote that. I'm 100% sure Don Rickles improvised that.
It was really funny, and it felt like something that he would say. One of the character developments I liked was all throughout the journey, there is this enmity between Crap Game and Big Joe, because I think Crap Game to him represents the worst opportunist, but over the course of the movie, Crap Game carries his own weight. He carries a .30 caliber weapon. He becomes part of the unit, and even at that point where he's now wounded.
Where'd he get it?
Well, he got it right here in the leg.
Anything else?
What do you mean, anything else? Ain't that enough for you?
How do you feel, Hustler?
Great. Since when did you ever give a damn how I felt?
Okay, wise guy, forget it.
I almost thought they were like going to break down and hug, but Crap Game, in his Don Rickles best, makes some crack that kind of breaks the moment so that what both men were going to say doesn't get said.
Right, which is typical in male-to-male interactions.
I think we would be remiss if we did not talk about the homage to Sergio Leone. There's a stalemate where Don Rickles, he says, then make a deal. Big Joe says, what kind of deal? Crap Game, a deal. Maybe the guy's a Republican. Business is business, right? And he's talking about the last remaining Tiger tank that is in front of the bank blocking their way. Then you have this scene where Clint Eastwood is shoulder to shoulder, Big Joe, and with Oddball. And the music starts into that music that's reminiscent of the good and the bad and the ugly. And as they're walking down, Oddball pulls his pistol and sticks it into the holster at a certain angle so that he can quick draw. And as they're walking down the street, you hear the subtle clinking of spurs, which made me love this scene because all of a sudden they went from subtle comedy to the unbelievable, outlandish, this is over the top at this point. Because there's these three men who are doing this walk down on this Tiger tank. And that is how they end up getting to speak to the Tiger Tank commander, who's like, what are you guys doing? And they tell them about what they're trying to do, and they're going to cut him in on the deal. And of course, he's a soldier like them, and he's ready to go for it.
And then the other thing that's subtle that you might not have noticed is that tank commander has to come down off of the tank. And it's a big, arduous process where he gets out of the tank, he climbs off the top. He basically has to come down off his high horse. And that's sort of the theme. At least that's what he's coming down to their level, because you see as they're walking up, they're very brave because he has several machine guns in that thing. He can just shoot
He could have torn them apart.
Right. So he obviously has an inkling that something more is going on. So he comes down off the top of that big tank, and then he walks out and talks to them. And I really love how they handled the last thing, which is they're talking, they kind of put the offer, and they just sort of show the door of the bank, and then the next thing you know, the bank door explodes, which is very satisfying.
Very satisfying. And the movie just kind of races to the very end. Okay, let's talk about it. Did this movie groove through the decades, or did it lose its beat?
I gotta say, out of all the movies we've watched, this grooved the least. It lost something in the time. It's too long, it's a little contrived, and the payoff, I don't think, is as satisfying as the build-up would require. So I say no.
I will say that the one thing I have going against it is that if somebody today was watching it, I would be interested if some of the social commentary on Vietnam would be completely lost. I enjoyed the film. It was overly long, and so I kind of agree with you on this one, that it's good. I would recommend it, but that it groove, may have skipped a beat on this one.
I think it's one of those movies that you can recommend, but you'd be careful who you recommended it to.
Right.
Good example is we reviewed Breaking Away. I would recommend that to anyone of any age, right?
Right.
Without reservation.
It's a universal story.
Right. I would do that the same for French Connection because it was such a seminal film, and it is exciting and interesting, and I would recommend that to anybody. This one, if your birth year begins with a 2, you're not going to be interested in this. It's going to be lost on you. It might be fun to see Clint Eastwood as a young, super handsome dude and Telly Savalas in his early film career. But I think you definitely, if you're of a certain age, let's say if you were born in maybe the 60s, this is a great flashback to the past and cinema that you would probably enjoy.
Comparing it to the other films that we've watched is why I don't think it grooves in the same way, say, that Dirty Harry grew.
I don't know if it was worth the $3.49 I spent to rent it.
I think that just about does it. So, Matt, thank you once again for coming on and talking about another movie from the 70s.
As usual, I enjoyed it quite a bit. And Chuck, you do a great job getting us prepared for this. And I think the production value at the end is also remarkable. So thanks for doing that. I know it's a lot of work.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate that. And also, I want to thank our listeners for joining us. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you want to contact us, you can email us at podcast@cinematicflashback.com or leave a comment on our Facebook page, the Cinematic Flashback Podcast. And we are now on X, and our handle is @Back270sMovies. We are trying to build up this show. We appreciate if you tell somebody, and if you could give us a review on a platform you're listening on. If you enjoyed the show, please give us a 5-star review so we can reach more listeners. So join us next time as we take the Wayback Machine to the 70s to explore another film from that decade. And if Donald Pleasant's character would just seem to be what his name says, which is oddball.
You mean Donald Sutherland?
Did I say Donald Pleasance? Yeah. Okay, that's our pigtail right there, because that's twice now that it's happened.